Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome back to the Reign of Horror channel and show. I'm your host, Nerd Cosa Nostra. And yeah, so today's topic is gonna be, I think, one of the most iconic franchises in horror, one of the most iconic characters, killers, villain, whatever you want to call him in horror. He's my favorite, my personal favorite, and if you can tell from what's behind me, you can clearly see and have an idea of who my favorite is, and of course that is the one and only Michael Myers, and that's the Halloween franchise. Now, today's episode, we're just gonna briefly kind of just go over some, I think, are the some, in my opinion, the two core, I think, aspects. One core aspect, and one thing that any fan, any viewer of the Halloween franchise, and I say franchise, I'm including, from the original from '78 all the way up until the recent trilogy reboot, remakes, new takes, whatever you want to call what these last three have been. Um, that's what I mean by the franchise. I'm not talking about just the originals. I'm not talking the attempt at the anthology, which was Halloween 3. I'm not talking about the Rob Zombie films, the remake with his and then his subsequent sequel. We're going to talk about all of them. So with this episode, the one thing we're going to focus on is just briefly is the timelines. And one thing, again, we've all seen is the evolution of the Myers mask, which has had some good times and some very, very bad times. When you compare them, when you actually see them side by side, and we'll take a look at them, and you'll know what I'm talking about. There's definitely been some huge misses when it comes to the Michael Myers mask. I have my personal favorites, but again, I have some that I just think to myself, what were we thinking? Even when it was being filmed, someone didn't think to stop the director or stop somebody to say, hey, is that really the mask that we're going for? Is that really the look we're going for? But it could have just been part of the times. It could have just been at the time when the movie was made that's what was best at the time. I find it hard to believe because we've seen other franchises like the Friday the 13th franchise and Nightmare on Elm Street happening around this exact same time frames, and some of their makeup and masks were still on par for the character. But it's just, man, some of these Myers masks, they just don't make sense to me. And yeah, I wish we could just get like a redo. There's a couple where I just wish we could just CGI right over them and pretend like the originals never happened. But anyways, let's not digress. We'll get to the mask here in a bit. But again, this episode, again, we're not going to focus on any one particular film in the franchise. We're going to kind of dive into each individual film at a later date. This is really just to set the tone. As I mentioned, Halloween is by far my favorite franchise when it comes to horror. Now, again, I've said this before. Like what you like, love what you love. We're not all going to like the same things. I'm sure there's going to be people who are going to disagree with me and say that they prefer Friday the 13th, they prefer Scream, they prefer the Conjuring universe. I mean, everyone's going to have their likes and their dislikes, right? I think that's one of the beauties about having an opinion, especially when it comes to films and TV shows. You can like something, I may not like something. I can like something, you may not like something, and that's fine. I think we can have a respectable and respectful common ground and an opinion and conversation, and still walk away, respecting each other's choices when it comes to films and TV shows. So yeah, so like I said, what we're going to be focusing on and we're going to jump into is the Halloween franchise, right? So today in this episode, we're just going to kind of focus on, again, the just a couple brief tidbits of information, but then we're really going to focus on the timeline and then the mask, like I mentioned. So, I mean, anyone who's watched horror or has even dabbled in horror has heard of Halloween, has heard of Michael Myers. You don't need to be an expert in this genre to know these two names, these two titles, right? Someone says Halloween when it comes to movies, they immediately know what you're talking about. You say Michael Myers, they immediately know what you're talking about, right? So while Halloween, especially when the first one came out in 1978, while it was not the first, we'll call it slasher film for the genre, I think it's hard to argue that that 1978's Halloween did not have a major impact, not just on the future of this franchise, but also bringing into existence some other franchises, right? Whether that was, and as I just mentioned, whether that was Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street, and then we had a gap. I think there was a gap of time where horror films, especially slasher films, kind of fell by the wayside. They weren't necessarily given a whole lot of attention. We did still see some horror movies here and there, but nothing that we could consider slasher until the Scream franchise came around. And I still think Scream in itself was influenced by, to some degree, by the Halloween franchise and the original '78 film. So again, I'm not saying these franchises would not have existed fully. They may have existed at some point, maybe some iteration of them, but I think we can confidently say that Halloween had an influence in bringing those to be. So again, no, while not the first slasher film, definitely one that I think had the greatest impact of any of them. Now, as I mentioned, we're going to jump right to that, which is the timelines here. I think when you compare the Halloween franchise to others I've already mentioned, and even some of the newer ones, right? I mean, Paranormal Activity has its own franchise of films. I mentioned The Conjuring. I mean, the Annabelle series, the Annabelle films. I mean, now Terrifier. Terrifier is they just added a third film to that franchise, right? So most of these franchises, they're staying along a path of progression of a timeline, or we see new characters coming in and the same villain, right? Now, I think Halloween's kind of unique in a way where, as you can see here, we've had three major timelines, an anthology timeline, and then we have the reboot, which is the Rob Zombie timeline. So I can't think of another franchise that's done this. Should this have been done? I don't necessarily think so, but I don't make the big bucks. I don't have the corner office to make those decisions. I'm just a fan like anybody else who just enjoys movies, enjoys horror movies. So I got what I got, and this is what it is, right? So as you can see here, we're going to focus first on the three timelines that are taking up the primary portion of the screen here. So in looking at this, and let's make this just a little bit bigger here. So we have the 1978 film, like I mentioned, Halloween, classic film, classic horror film. Everyone knows that film. You mentioned a Halloween film or a horror film. Halloween is probably gonna be one of the first ones that comes to mind by any fan, right? So what happened there? So two timelines continued on from this first Halloween film, right? So we have the sequel timeline. We're gonna start with that one first. So we end up with Halloween 2. Halloween 2, as anyone knows and has seen it, it's a continuation of the night from the first Halloween, right? So we know at the end of that Halloween 78, Laurie is eventually taken away in an ambulance, and then we see that pickup in Halloween 2 where she's at the hospital, and the large portion of Halloween 2 happens at Haddonfield Hospital, where Michael shows up, and ultimately at the end, I mean, this shouldn't be a spoiler. This movie came out in 1981. At the end, and at the time, you would have believed, okay, he's killed because Dr. Loomis not only shoots him twice, once in each eye, then he blows him up. So I think at the time, everyone could have easily said, "Oh, Michael Myers is dead. This is where the Halloween franchise ends." Right? Well, that's not necessarily the case. If we continue on that sequel timeline, I'll go through these fairly quickly. We end up in, we there's a gap between Halloween 2 and Halloween 4, which we jump right over to the anthology timeline, which is Halloween 3, which came out in 82. While John Carpenter and Deborah Hill were involved in that film, it had no bearing, no focus on Michael Myers. Now, there were, little tidbits in there. Like, for example, there's a scene where there's a TV on and Halloween, one of the Halloween films is playing on the TV. But outside of that, the focus is not on the Myers character. The focus is completely shifted, right? Now, obviously, the results of that film weren't nearly as successful as I'm sure many, like the studio and everyone, would have thought it was, which is why they shifted right back to the Michael Myers storyline in 1988 with Halloween 4, The Return of Michael Myers. So while Halloween 4 doesn't necessarily pick up from the Halloween 2, where Halloween 2 ended, there's definitely a massive time jump where we no longer have the Laurie Strode character played by Jamie Lee Curtis. We now have Jamie Lloyd, who's played by Danielle Harris, a young child, who is set up to be and is presented to us as Laurie's daughter, right? So we see that character, we see that play out from the 1988 film into 89, with Danielle Harris coming back and playing Jamie Lloyd again in Halloween 5. And then subsequently, the sequel timeline ends with Halloween 6, which there was even some controversy with Halloween 6, right? Anyone that might not be aware, or most people would be aware, Halloween 6, the theatrical cut, which is the cut we've had for decades, and again, since 1995. And there was always that rumor floating around where there was this bootleg producer's cut of Halloween 6 that kind of adjusted the story a little bit, that focused a little bit more on the whole Thorn aspect of how Michael Myers, gets his powers, and the witchcraft of this. And we do see we see an older version of Jamie Lloyd at the beginning. Spoiler again, this shouldn't be a spoiler since it came out in 95. She is killed at the beginning of the film, and so she does have a baby, which again, if we follow the progression of the story, that would then be Laurie Strode's grandchild. But again, Laurie Strode doesn't show up in these three films, non-existent. And so that producer's cut eventually made its way to light with the Blu-ray release box set of the franchise, of these franchise films. We eventually got the producer's cut, and again, if you haven't seen it, I would recommend checking it out. It was just one of those urban legend things back in the 90s that you heard about, but it was always a rarity to ever come across and actually see it if it wasn't a bootleg copy. But now anyone can own it, whether it's on digital, whether it's physical, you can actually own it. So I recommend checking that out. And then for the longest time, that's where the Halloween franchise ended, and with the 95 film, right? Up until we got H2O in 1998. Right. So again, if we start over with the timeline and we go back to 78 goes into Halloween 2, 81, and then the sequel timelines 4, 5, and 6 no longer exist now. We jump now to Halloween and again 1998, which is more commonly known as H2O or H20, however you want to phrase that, which is 20 years later from the 78 film. And it picks up with Laurie Strode. Now, keeping him interesting tidbit, this is one of the only, outside the anthology film, I believe the only Halloween film where it did not take place within the story, it didn't take place in Haddonfield. It actually took place outside of Haddonfield. It took place at this private school where Laurie Strode, going under a different name, is like headmaster, so to speak, of the school, and is in charge of the school. And we are introduced to her son, who's played by Josh Hartnett. Again, We have no mention of her daughter, Jamie Lloyd, as there was no mention in the sequel timeline of her having a son. Now she just happens to have a son who's a teenager and goes to the school as well, right? So this movie plays out, and again, this is we're calling the H2O or the H20 timeline. And then from that film, we move into Halloween Resurrection in 2002. And in this film, I think it's one of my least favorite of the entire franchise. Try to take more of a, I think, again, thinking of the time this came out in 2002, was trying to be more in tune with the times of what was popular then, and which you see Busta Rhymes, Tyra Banks in it. So, and it was more of that. Let's lock and as the story shows, let's lock everybody in this house for the night, set up cameras, and let's just film them. Unbeknownst to them, that true Michael Myers shows up and starts killing everybody. But and this is where we see the first killing off of Jamie Lee Curtis's character, Laurie Strode, at the very beginning of the film. Michael finally kills her, and in this timeline, that's the last we see of her. And this is the last film we see in this timeline. The H2O timeline doesn't continue from there. Her son, we never saw Josh Hartnett's character again from H2O into this one. It was once Laurie was killed, that was pretty much it. We got introduced to new characters, which again didn't really amount to anything. That's really where that ended. Now, we then, after 2002, moved into the Rob Zombie remakes, Rob Zombie's timeline, which happened in the first one happened in 2007, and then the follow-up was in 2009. Now outside of Resurrection, now I don't mind Rob Zombie's films. I don't mind his taste. I'm okay with it. Doesn't bother me a bit. However, when it comes to the Halloween story, when it comes to the Michael Myers story, his direction was vastly different than any of the timelines we've seen, even the new ones from Blumhouse, the new trilogy. Much more, I don't want to say maybe more grounded, but much more raw, much more in your face, like all of Rob Zombie's films are, right? So that was no surprise. Now, do I necessarily care for these films? Are these two films I reach for when I think horror or when I think Halloween? No, I don't. These kind of go. I mean, will I watch them from time to time? Absolutely. I'll revisit them if it's been a while, just to revisit them. But again, they're not. Let's put it this way: I'm going to reach for Halloween 4, 5, or 6 from the sequel timeline before I reach for the Rob Zombie films. That's just my preference. That's just my personal taste. But again, he's much more grounded, much more raw, much more in your face, like all of his films are. But to each his own. I know some people who actually like these films, actually like his 2007 Halloween much more than the 78 Halloween. I don't agree with that either. But hey, again, everyone has their own taste, right? So. We all know there were some challenges with Rob Zombie's film, his first film. Now, I'm not saying we had challenges as fans. He had challenges in making the film. Obviously, he was contracted to do the two films. After the first film, there was no secret he did not enjoy doing that film. As far as the difficulties between doing the film, studio heads, executives, seems like that's more of a common thing now that we hear about than back then, when you really didn't hear about it until years later after a film was done. Then you would find out through some interview how horrible the experience was and why a director either didn't do something or did do something. But nowadays, it seems like as soon as before a film's even fully out in cinemas or on physical release, we're already hearing about the challenges or difficulties. Even in pre-production, post-production, we hear about these things, right? I just think it wasn't as common then as it is now. But nonetheless, Rob Zombie had those challenges, and they actually had to convince him to even come back and do a second film. Now, the first film was, in their eyes, as far as the studio's eyes, was successful, and so which is why they wanted him to come back and do the sequel that he originally agreed to. But he came back doing so and pretty much drawing the line in the sand, saying, "This is it. I'm not doing another one after this. I'll do it. I'll do the second film, but I'm done after this. I'm tapped out." Obviously, he did the film, and obviously, we never got a third film in his timeline. So, and again, that was what, in 2009. So that was a lot. Again, when we think about all the other timelines, now we have another gap of time between 2009 and 2018 when we get now the next Halloween film called Halloween. So now we have three films in three different timelines called Halloween. Here we still start off with the 78 film as the foundation, the groundwork for the character Laurie Strode. And again, yes, Laurie Strode is now back in this. When you think about the sequel timeline, we didn't see her for those last three films, and then we didn't see her for one of the films in the H20 timeline, H2O timeline. So now she's back in this, and one of the differences here is when we compare this, and now I'm gonna ignore for a moment the Rob Zombie timeline and the anthology timeline, because the next bits of information, bits that we're going to cover, don't necessarily impact those timelines or have anything to do with those. It's more to do with the sequel timeline and the H2O timeline. So again, using 1978 as our foundation, we see Laurie Strode, and one of the differences here is that they don't mention the fact that Michael Myers is her brother. We saw that in the sequel timeline. We saw that in the H2O timeline, and it was blatantly mentioned. He's my brother. Now, there's two camps here. One can say, well, it's not her brother. It was just Michael Myers on Halloween night, 1978, killing people. She happened to get away, and now Michael's trying to track her down and kill her. Or it is still, in fact, her brother. It's just not blatantly mentioned and called out that it's her brother, right? So it very well could still be the brother. But nonetheless, we pick up 40 now. Now it's 40 years later, and we're kind of playing this story out where Michael is still, again, trying to kill Laurie, and not just Laurie. Now trying to kill her daughter, then the granddaughter, and obviously, I'm a little torn on this new take, not take, this new trilogy, this new timeline trilogy for Halloween. I thought the first one definitely had some great things in it. I did like the tone. I liked especially how we're going to talk about the mask here in a bit. I loved how they handled the evolution of the mask when compared to other timelines and other sequels. But obviously, this being 40 years later, we know Laurie's much older. Obviously, now we have a very much older Michael, and we start to see that in this trilogy as not only as the mask deteriorates, but as Michael takes damage, so to speak, throughout this trilogy. We definitely see the wear and tear on him. He's not the same Michael Myers we saw in 78 or in some of the sequel timeline sequences where he's just this entity of evil. He's being viewed more as, he's an entity of evil, but now he's humanized a bit, where he's not as, where in part 3 or part 2 when he gets his hand blown off by a shotgun, right? I mean, his battle wounds are now really starting to affect him and starting to slow him down. So we go from Halloween again in 2018, then we get the 2021 follow-up, Halloween Kills, which of the three is my favorite, and then we end up with Halloween Ends in 2022, which is the most controversial of the three, because it shifts the focus from Michael onto another character in the film, who kind of takes over the reins of or is trying to take over the reins for Michael, and Michael is again more of a secondary now character. I'm in the camp. I'm in definitely in the camp of it wasn't my favorite of this new trilogy. I was definitely slightly disappointed. Again, I see what they were trying to do. I understand what they were trying to do with the shift in the story. Was it what I wanted to see? Was it what I expected? No, it wasn't. Not from a Halloween movie, not from something I'm expecting just to see Michael Myers just kind of running, so to speak, running through people, just being that, again, that evil entity, killing everybody, right? That's what you expect from Michael Myers. He's not one of these horror villains who has to chase down his prey, right? He slowly just kind of walks, and then he manages to get there. You're not going to escape him. He's always going to catch you, right? So that was the whole draw of the character, the boogeyman, right? Kind of in the shadows, in the dark, and once you think you've gotten away, you've escaped him. You haven't. So yeah, again, like I said, I'm in the camp of while I enjoyed the foundation of the H40 timeline, I enjoyed the second film, Halloween Kills. I wasn't the biggest fan of Halloween Ends. And again, this we'll get into all the details of each of these films in later episodes. We'll do kind of a deep dive. We'll pick a timeline. We're going to start with that timeline, and we're going to work our way through those films and kind of pick apart, the story aspects. Where some things might have worked, where some things may not have worked. So yeah, so before we jump to the mask, some people who might be new to the Halloween franchise, which I can't imagine there are going to be too many, but if you're new to horror, you're going to probably be new to the Halloween franchise, or you may not be fully aware of many the sequels. You might know about 78, you might know about the recent, Halloween Ends and maybe H2O, but some people may not fully be exposed to, Halloween's, 4, 5, and 6, or the anthology timeline, right? So while some people will say, well, where do I start? Which timeline should I go with? I'd say obviously start with the 78 film, right? And then really based on your interest, if you want to see something more modern, then I'd say go for the H40 timeline. If you kind of want to see more of a sequential story, I'd say stick with the sequel timeline, right? If you want something just, quick hit, kind of entertaining, more of a popcorn flick type time, then go with H2O, right? Because again, it's the shortest of the timelines. Those movies aren't that long, and they're very quick. And to me, I think again, they're more just entertaining popcorn type films. While they're not, none of these films are meant to be like in-depth, award-winning dramas, and they're not going to be. I still don't view them as the most intricate of the overall franchise. So real quick, let's jump to just taking a time check here. So let's just jump to the evolution of the mask. Now we can look at this, and I think some of these obviously stand out as some of the worst masks possible, right? And I can tell you right now, there are at least, I can look on here and say there's at least 4 of these, maybe 5, that I would just question, what were we thinking? It makes no sense to me. How we got there as far as from a production costume standpoint. Why didn't somebody stop somebody from putting that mask on Michael Myers? So obviously, but they kind of go in the order of the films. So we got, anyone who doesn't know, the original Myers mask was done off a William Shatner Star Trek mask, based on the 60s TV show. So that's how the original Myers mask came to be. Now, if we see here if we start with the top row, you have Halloween 1, you have Halloween 2, and then we definitely take a downward spiral. Halloween 4 is which is the third one in the top row, is one of the worst Myers masks. Whether it's the mask, it's the hair, everything about this mask, in my opinion, is just garbage, trash, horrible. Then if we look at, we move to Halloween 5, it didn't get any better. You can tell they tried to get a little scarier with the look, even with the hair looking a little bit more grunge look. Still didn't hit the mark, in my opinion. And then if we now go to the second row, Halloween 6 still didn't do any justice. And now we've given him these coveralls that are much lighter in color. But again, the mask just again doesn't do the character justice. And again, we continue now with this downward spiral into H2O, which is the second one on the second row. I don't know what we were thinking with the hair, with this kind of spiked, fluffy look. I think that's what killed that mask. And then the eyes. The eyes are. If we look back up, all the other eyes, maybe except for this Halloween 2, we can kind of see his eyes a little bit. But H2O, it's like the holes in the eyes were cut out way too big. I mean, if they would have somehow darkened some black makeup on the face, something to make them a little bit more dark, more depth to it, right? So you couldn't just see that maybe these holes were cut too big. I don't know. It just doesn't look good. Bad look. And then Resurrection looks even worse. It's like we fixed the eyes, but the rest of the mask we just screwed up. It just looks so bad. Whether it's the whole thing with these lines around the mouth from the nose down to the cheeks, it just does not look good at all. We then jump into the two, we look at the last one on row 2 and the first one on row 3. These are the Rob Zombie mask. Obviously, you can see much more battle tested, battle worn, so to speak, especially for Halloween 2. It's a much more torn up, much more battle worn. My personal favorites, though, outside the original mask, are for the new trilogy, the new mask. I mean, these 3 masks, there was definitely something I think they did well in the new trilogy with Halloween Kills, and Halloween Ends, is you saw as Michael was going through it, while he was getting tested, while he was, taking attacks as well, his mask showed it. So you see here in that bottom row, those last 3, his mask looks, it's weathered, it's old. Obviously, it's meant to be 40 years old. But as the 2 sequels came on, you can see in these pictures, the mask got more and more battle damage. The more things he got involved in, the worse his mask got, right? So that was definitely something that I did enjoy that they took into account for the trilogy series. So yeah, so again, these are the masks. Again, I think there were some definite hits and some big misses when it came to costume design in this franchise. I would say any current horror franchise looking to do a masked character, definitely take some notes here. Don't make these mistakes. I mean, I think one of the ones that we've seen more recently that's kind of making its comeback franchise-wise is Scream. But Ghostface is staying pretty true to what Ghostface has always looked like. I mean, yeah, the mask has changed from maybe from the color, it's not so bright white as it was in Scream 1 when we think about the latest Scream film. But overall, Ghostface has stayed pretty consistent, pretty much the same. Hasn't really deviated much. We've seen some deviation in Jason's mask, obviously, whether it's weathered, whether it's been hit with a machete, whether it's been hit with whatever, it's been battle worn. These aren't battle worn. These are just one sequel to another sequel, or one movie to another. Someone just picked a completely different mask and said, let's just call this Michael Myers, right? So that was a definite mistake there. So anyway, so like I said, that's pretty much all we're going to cover in this episode today. Again, I just wanted to touch on some of the basics, which is the timeline and the mask, which I think are while the mask isn't the most critical thing when we think about Halloween, we think about Michael Myers, I think it's one of those things that just stands out completely when you see the character, especially if you're watching any of these films back to back. If you are interested in watching any of the timelines, you're going to see that. It's going to be one of the most standout things possible is when you see Michael, you're going to think, well, wait a minute, that's not the mask he was wearing before in the last movie I just watched. Why does he look so different? And then obviously the timeline itself, right? So like I said, in future episodes, we're going to get into each film where we'll focus on a timeline and kind of break down the films. One of the things I love about some of these older films is the movie mistakes that we see. One I'll call out is the end of Halloween 78, where Loomis is in the house and shoots Michael. unloads his revolver, and Michael falls over the banister onto the ground. And by the time the film ends, Dr. Loomis runs out there, who's played by Donald Pleasance, if you don't know, and Michael's body is gone. And that's kind of how the film ends. We don't know what happened to Michael. Now, Halloween 2 picks up where this is happening. Picks up, we're back in the house. We're getting ready to see this shootout. But then the camera angle now changes, and we go outside, and we're hearing the gunshots, and you actually look up and you see Michael on the banister, and he's backing up onto a ramp and then falls off into the ground. I mean, you can clearly see he's backing up on a ramp and then falls to the ground, versus in the first film where he's being shot and kind of tumbles over the banister. So it's things like that that I think some of these older films, especially horror films, we call them movie mistakes, call them miscues, whatever you want to call them. I always just find that they're always fun. They're always fun to find, and when you, especially when it's in the same franchise, going from movie to movie. So, all right, everyone, then we're gonna wrap it up there. Thanks for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe. What we're gonna look to do here is try to do some weekly and daily shows, focusing strictly on horror films, horror movies, anything to do with horror. And then what we're also going to get into is just doing some live shows where we just, what's the latest going on in the horror genre, as far as what's recently come out, what's upcoming, especially in 2024. We've definitely seen some new ideas as far as some of these films. One of the films that stands out to me, which I enjoyed earlier this year, was Late Night with the Devil. Was nice to see. I don't want to call it a period piece, but definitely a piece that you can tell was taking place in the 70s on a talk show. It definitely touched on some of the things that we saw in the 70s, where you had these individuals come on these shows thinking that they're trying to convince everyone that they're psychic, and they're not psychic, and they were all proven wrong. So I did like the fact that it played on that, something that we've actually seen in the real world. So anyways, everyone, have a great night, and I will see you at the next one. Peace.